Europe looks strong on paper. Big economies, high-tech industry, and now almost the whole Baltic Sea ringed by NATO after Finland and Sweden joined. But there are weak spots, geographic choke points, fragile infrastructure, and a political system that can be jammed by a single veto or influenced by outside money. I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defence Forces, and today I want to walk through where Europe is most exposed, and what that means in a world where Russia is reckless, China is patient, and even friends like the United States can pull Europe off balance. Start in the North Atlantic at a line sailors and submariners know by heart, the GIUK Gap, Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. It's the gateway between the Arctic and the Atlantic. In wartime, whoever controls that gap can slow or stop reinforcement of Europe by sea. After years of neglect, NATO is paying attention again because Russia rebuilt parts of its northern fleet while the West let some anti-submarine skills wither away. The sheer size of this area, bigger than the entirety of mainland Europe in area, makes it incredibly hard to patrol. But Norway and the UK have taken vital steps towards securing this area by investing in respectively 5 and 9 P-8 Poseidon patrol and anti-submarine aircraft recently, which goes a long way. The issue in this area, on top of the vital importance of supply lanes, is that much of Europe and North America's internet connections run through here and a bit further south in the Atlantic, making it incredibly vulnerable to the kind of sabotage seen in the Baltic in recent times. If Russian and Chinese assets can be kept away, the treasure trove of cables in the Atlantic will be kept safe. Push a bit east, and the Arctic becomes a chessboard. Russia's Kola Peninsula and its capital in Murmansk bristles with submarines and long-range systems. China talks openly about a polar Silk Road, signaling long-term commercial and scientific presence and cooperation with Russia in this area. With Sweden and Finland in NATO, every Arctic state but Russia is now inside the alliance, which means that Russia's Murmansk-St. Petersburg highway is now within artillery range of the most concentrated artillery reserve in Europe. Another possible flashpoint is Svalbard. Norway is sovereign there since 1920. Moscow keeps a foothold through its Soviet-era mining company town at Barentsburg and uses that presence as a pressure point, pro-war parades, symbols, and periodic political theater over access and logistics, even though the mining town is essentially no longer actively mining. Even small moves on Svalbard echo loudly because the rules are unusual and the optics matter. It's pressure by paperwork and publicity rather than troops, but it still bites. Down in the Baltic Sea, the map is unforgiving. The Suwałki Gap, the 65-kilometer neck of land between Poland and Lithuania, keeps the Baltic states connected to the rest of NATO and sits between Belarus and Russia's Kaliningrad exclave. In military circles, this has been the area where NATO has been the most scared of Russian attacks since Poland and the Baltics joined the alliance. The Baltic Sea itself is shallow, crowded, and full of cables and pipes, which makes infrastructure part of the battle space. After a string of anchor dragging and sabotage incidents, NATO and the EU now treat subsea security as a real mission, not a theoretical one, and even nations like France, who technically has very little to do with the area, is stepping in to help with its surveillance capability. Sweden's island of Gotland is the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of that sea. If a hostile power held it, resupplying the Baltics by air or sea would be incredibly hard. That's why Sweden has re-garrisoned the island and is knitting its air and sea defenses into NATO plans. With Sweden in the alliance, the Baltic looks much more defensible, but only if Gotland is hard to touch. For Northern Europe, perhaps the largest risk is the Russian shadow oil fleet of older, often underinsured tankers carrying Russian oil through the Danish Straits and the Gulf of Finland. Coastal states and the EU are tightening checks on insurance and ownership, but the risk is still there. The Baltic is shallow and semi-enclosed, with limited water exchange, meaning a major spill could linger and spread in ways the region has never faced. One bad hull in the wrong weather could turn into an ecological disaster, and recent anchor-dragging incidents show how vulnerable cables and power links are to sloppy or cynical seamanship. Something which is often overlooked is the space domain. Europe's best launch site isn't in Europe at all. It's the Guiana Space Center in French Guiana, about 7,000 kilometers from Paris and just north of the equator. The latitude gives rockets a free boost from Earth's rotation, which is why Ariane and Vega launch from there. France's armed forces guard the site, and launch days come with air and sea restrictions, but the distance is still huge. France and Britain have blue water navies and can project power, yet any crisis far from home stretches attention and logistics. At best, France could field a jungle warfare campaign with the French Foreign Legion units stationed there to hold out until firepower arrives from Europe. But this could take weeks. The general isolation of French Guiana from Europe makes it a prime target for sabotage. Europe's risks aren't mainly geographical, even though this is a big part of the equation. One big sore risk factor is that Europe's foreign policy needs a 100% vote in the EU Parliament in key areas, which means one leader can jam the gears. We've watched Hungary stall sanctions renewals and Ukraine funding, and Slovakia under Robert Fico use its veto on measures that hit its energy interests, relenting only after side deals or pressure. Even when compromises come, delays help the people applying pressure from the outside in order to affect the policy of the entire government. One Orban or Fico-sized Russian asset can essentially stop the world's second-largest trading bloc from enacting policy. Foreign money and media matter because they can slip into the gaps of Europe's politics. A clear example is Marine Le Pen's party taking a multi-million euro loan from a Russian bank in 2014, legal under French rules at the time, but a reminder of how financing can become leverage later. Incidentally, she took this loan as Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time. Coincidence? Maybe. In Britain, the decision to award a life peerage to Russian-born media owner Evgeny Lebedev sparked questions about political vetting and the resilience of appointments. Since 2024, investigators across the EU have also targeted a pro-Kremlin influence network around the site Voice of Europe, alleging that lawmakers were approached and in some cases paid to push Russian talking points ahead of elections. Not every allegation becomes a conviction, and several figures deny wrongdoing, but the pattern is hard to miss: money, messaging, and middlemen aimed at Europe's political fault lines. Italy had an early brush with the same playbook in the 2019 Metropole affair, when recordings suggested an oil-for-cash scheme to benefit the party league. The deal never happened, but it showed how Moscow tests doors across the continent to see which ones open. And the tactic isn't only cross-border. In Norway this year, a small party campaigning to end aid to Ukraine ran high-profile ads that later turned out to be funded by large donations from a Norwegian businessman with deep ties to Russia, prompting calls for full transparency on political money. China's approach is different, more patient and commercial, but still political. It builds leverage through ports, logistics, and technology deals, then pairs that with lobbying and access. Chinese state-owned companies hold long-term stakes in European ports. Parliaments and security services across Europe have warned about political interference and alleged espionage tied to Chinese interests, including arrests and building bans for some corporate lobbyists. None of this means China runs Europe. It does mean that vulnerabilities exist at the junction of trade, tech, and politics, and that Europe needs to police that junction better. China's influence is a lot softer than both Russia and the US approach, which makes it that much more effective. All of this lands in a media and money environment where US-based conservative networks have also been active. Over the past decade, American so-called advocacy groups and donors have spent significant sums influencing European social policy fights and campaigns, often in step with Europe's hard right and populists. CPAC, a conservative movement and think tank, even has a European franchise in Budapest with Viktor Orban as the star attraction. This isn't a case of US parties bankrolling candidates directly. European law restricts that. But it is an ecosystem that amplifies messages, trains activists, and normalizes links across the Atlantic. In a system where small vote swings can empower veto players, that matters, and it is symbolic that CPAC is heavily involved in both Hungary and Slovakia, who in turn are very skeptical of the EU and European values. So how brittle is Europe really? Militarily, a heck of a lot less brittle than 2 years ago. The northern flank is more secure than ever. NATO has more eyes and ears in the high north, and Europe has finally started to treat defense industry as a real capability, not a talking point. Ammunition output is ramping, missile lines are expanding, and a sprawling set of European programs is pushing joint buys and shared stockpiles. The trend line is better, but bottlenecks remain in explosives, guidance components, and skilled labor. I'll end on a sober note. The weak spots aren't failures, they're pressure points. The North Atlantic choke points remind Europe how much it still relies on the sea and on allies. The Baltic shows how civilian infrastructure is now part of deterrence. French Guiana reminds Europe that even its space access is vulnerable to distance and politics. And the influence stories, Russian money, Chinese lobbying, American culture war cash, show that Europe's open societies are strengths that need real defenses. The fix isn't panic. It's patience, production, and politics that don't fall apart at the first whiff of pressure. That's how you turn weak spots into tripwires, so any attempt to probe them ends up strengthening, not breaking, Europe. If the last half a year has proven anything, it is that outside pressure has rallied a lot of Europe, and that's set to continue for at least another 3.5 years. As always, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you haven't already, we'd be honored if you hit that subscribe button. Nearly 80% of our regular viewers aren't subscribed, and we hope that you might consider doing so.